Well, hello everybody, I'm Gary, I'm the Lantana Guru. They call me the Lantana Legend. So I did a bit of a expose on the Premier changing the classification on Lantana just a day or so ago. And biosecurity's policy that they want me to actually bring the parties to the actual infestations and talk to them directly, not to include biosecurity, whose responsibility it is to enforce the Biosecurity Act. But you know, for decades it's been noted that Lantana at the point of planting these forestry plantations is 15% of the cost of planting the plantations. At harvest time, Lantana makes up 25% of the cost of harvesting the material. But when you look through areas like this, and this is continuous for kilometre after kilometre after kilometre, you can see how bad the Lantana is and how bad the other weeds are. So I just thought I'd take you for a bit of a drive and show you just how massive these infestations are in between all of these trees, to give you an idea of this. Now, I've often said to people, Lantana's not a victimless crime. It has real consequence for anybody else that's downstream of the infestations. So areas like this that are in lowland plantations end up with material flowing for miles and miles and miles downstream. In fact, I've done quite a few jobs in areas where these materials exit these forests, and the devastation that it causes to the watercourses going down through those places there. You can have a look back through there at how bad that is, and you can also see how this material gathers on the drainage ditches. And the Premier, because of my work, now accepts, and so does all the other departments, that water and gravity are the major spreaders of Lantana. So that's 20 feet high, that Lantana there on both sides of the road. But see how it follows the drainage ditch around this corner, because it likes how much water it gets access to. But over the back there, the materials are even higher as it goes further and further down the corridors of these forestries. But you can imagine the seed output. This is winter in a very, very shaded and very, very cool environment, and these plants are still flowering, still putting out seeds, and still distributing seeds into the watercourse. And that's how they disperse further and further throughout the system, because the seeds actually float. Same with the wild tobacco. So it's a brilliant way for these materials to propagate even further downstream. You can see down that area there how overgrown the paths are through those areas. But the Premier does nothing about this. And biosecurity says, well, you know what, you'd have to talk to the departments that are responsible for that, like bring out TMR to TMRs, which is main roads, infestations, and try to deal with them there. Well, main roads, TMR, are one of the worst organisations as far as their arrogance towards the environment. It's incredible that on their websites they claim that they have environmental policies, and yet they won't even come to site to see where the infestations are and the level of them. Although they know that they're there and the levels, they won't even come out to discuss it. And the councils say that they won't enforce against any government department. And the next worst one is national parks. They are absolute criminals in what they allow to happen to our environment. It's disgrace. So you look at how all these materials just flow all along these areas, through these watercourses and through these forestry areas. This is hundreds of square kilometres of these infestations like this, all flowing into watercourses that flow down to the estuarine systems. You know, this is only a stone's throw from the estuaries and critical mangrove areas, and the seeds float all the way down there. You look at all of that across the roadway there, and as far as you can see in every direction, the size of these plants over here in this. And how long those plants have been growing there and dispersing their seeds throughout the entire ecology. You know, we should be able to jail people like the Premier and the heads of biosecurity for this. You know, if they're not willing to defend our ecology, then they should not be in those jobs. And the millions upon millions of dollars that this is costing just in a local area like this in here, these people should be held accountable, but it's billions of dollars across the states, between $37 billion and $75 billion yearly cost to deal with. And yet they don't put any, they got $5 million budget spread across all weeds. It's incredible. See, they scraped the drainage ditch here to keep the drainage ditch open, but look at the lantana growing all along the edge of it. And you can't see anywhere back into there because the infestations just, you know, go back so far. The entire ecosystem is completely drowned in this material, floating its seeds down these watercourses and into the estuary systems, only a stone's throw further downstream. Absolutely horrific to see the level of these infestations and what it does to the environment. Nothing can get through it. Absolutely terrible. This would be almost cultivating lantana, because you're definitely growing it, there's no two ways about it. But the government says the excuse is that they can't control it. Well, you don't let it grow, you keep taking it out until it doesn't have a seed bank. The trouble is, once they allow the seed bank to get to what it is here, it's absolutely horrific, the outcomes. An absolutely terrible environmental disaster that nobody cares about. So biosecurity says that they would like me to go and get the entities that are responsible for it and ask them to come to site and have a look at the these materials, and those entities like national parks, TMR, all say that they're not interested. Biosecurity say that their heads of biosecurity say that there's no value in them coming out and seeing the level of lantana in these places because, well, they don't say it because, but the reality of what they say is because they gave up on it. They were actually the ones who advised the Premier to lower the classification on lantana, and that allowed the councils then to claim that lantana was no longer an issue and that it was low risk. And in Brisbane City Council's case, which is one of the worst councils, including Logan Council, they all called it very low risk. And in fact, Logan Council said that it's not even noxious anymore, which is another lie that the councils are spreading through their systems. But the Premier hit back at the councils and said, no, I never said it was low risk. So there's a bit of back and forth there of them dobbing each other in, but they're all operating like scumbags when you look at what this does to the environment. And nothing lives in this material once it reaches stage 3 infestation. Once it's full infestation, nothing lives in it and nothing lives under it, and it destroys the soil health. Okay, it's an absolute lie where people say that there's soil health underneath lantana is good. If the soil was good before lantana was there, it's not as good as what it was once lantana's been allowed to get to this sort of levels of infestations. And even if you take the lantana off, the leaves still have a liliopathic nature for a considerable amount of time after the material's been removed off the ground. But, you know, the biggest thing is to not allow it to get established in the first place. Protect your boundaries. Even if you keep your property clean and you break the cycle of lantana being able to link up with another infestation further, you know, downstream, upstream, whichever it is, you are having a major impact in suppressing lantana. Okay, you're not going to be perfect until biosecurity or the councils protect your right to be protected. And if you clean up your property, you should have the right to go to those entities and say, I want you to support me in asking my neighbours to clean up so my land's not reinfested. But because the councils and biosecurity are so corrupt and so incompetent in their abilities with Lantana, they won't take on any of the major infestors like TMR, Main Roads, and National Parks and Wildlife, Water Board, Queensland Rail, who else? Correctional Services. The list goes on of all the departments that own lands that have major infestations on them. The government will not take any action to clean up those materials. So that way, your land just gets consumed. And that's just not good enough because, you know, at this point in time, we're losing about 4 to 6 million hectares a year in increased new lands being illegally consumed by Lantana under the Biosecurity Act 2014, because no other reason than the parties that are supposed to enforce it will not enforce against government, because they say if they enforce against those departments, then they've got to come after you, the Australian citizen, the landowner in Australia. They've got to come after you. And I said, but hold on a minute, wouldn't it be true that they would have to enforce stronger against the biggest distributors of Lantana? And biosecurity said no, not like you'd think. No, it will be the general public that pays the price. Now, I don't know about you, but I find it very obscene that they hold a gun to your head and say that because the government, the state government, the Anastasia Palaszczuk government, has 80 to 85% of all the infestations, then at the end of the day, they will go after you as a recourse for, you know, them having to clean up. If it gets to that stage, at the moment, there's no cleanup at all. You know, Lantana itself, by the beginning of next year, will be a $250 billion low-risk problem covering 20 million hectares. Okay? The cleanup per year, just to meet the growth rate on Lantana, would be around $37 billion to $75 billion just to meet the growth rate. Okay? Nothing else. So your scumbags within the government say to you that they're arguing over a $5 million commitment to prickly acacia, not Lantana. Lantana's off the food list. It doesn't exist as far as they're concerned. And as you have seen, it exists very, very healthily over thousands and thousands of square kilometres and has no plans to do anything at all. So how does this, or what does this look like in another 10 years' time under this current system of governance? Well, you're right, it won't exist. My work won't allow it to exist like that. There will be a complete change to the way it's dealt with. But the problem is that when the government does do that, the government will do what they're saying there and go at people with absolutely no moral content. Okay? There will be punishment for them having left this. Anastasia Palaszczuk is the first person in my knowledge in the whole world to ever lower the classification on Lantana. Can you imagine the insanity of that? In 60 countries around the world, Lantana is in the top 10 of all weeds worldwide. 10 of the top universities in Australia say that Lantana is number one. That's top 10 in a recently released report. It's number one. The next weed under Lantana is half of the value of Lantana. Okay? Half of the problem of Lantana. Now, the thing with the Lantana and with that study is that it says that a lot of the feral animals actually do more damage than what the Lantana does overall. But all of those animals, all of them, are restricted in their movements and restricted in their habitat. So the further that Lantana becomes like that, the more it forces animals out of those areas and into smaller condensed areas with higher impacts on those areas. So in fact, Lantana would be even worse than all of those animals because of the way it congests all of the animals. And in that specific thing as well, in Moreton Bay Regional Council area on the north side of Brisbane, last year in 2018, they went to the biosecurity conference and bragged that they had a wild dog operation in which 3 wild dogs killed 11 koalas, 11 of them. One dog killed 8 and the other 2 dogs killed the other 3. Now, they have refused to give me the location of where they say that happened, but in anything like a war or anything like that, every time there are fatalities, there's about 10 injuries compared to 1 fatality. So how many koalas were decimated, right, that weren't killed, okay, and how many of them weren't found, and how much did Lantana play in that position? You have a look in this. This is a completely new spot, have never been here before. Nothing is under that Lantana. Nothing moves in that Lantana. The leaf litter is completely untouched everywhere you look. Why would anything go under something like this structure? Light doesn't get properly to the ground anymore. There's no more grasses down there. There's no more other organisms that are feeding on something else. It is completely destroyed, and the subsoil health is being destroyed because no light and no other organisms get there. Lantana is complete biodiversity loss, 110%. It just completely consumes everything. All the animals are displaced, and then once all the animals are displaced and the actual infestations link up, right, so that's a separate infestation of this one. As that becomes stage 3, where it takes over, which you would class this one as stage 3, okay, the beginnings of stage 3, you can see it's now climbing vertically into the trees and things like that. Now, in a forestry like this, where your trees are 80 feet, 100 feet tall, it's not going to get to the top unless there's cockspur or something else, or vines to help it go up the rest of the way. But it will get to be 30 and 40 feet deep and nothing gets through it. You can see how this infestation, these plants here, are going to link up with those ones, and they've already started the intertwining between them to where all light is cut off to the ground. So the dishonesty of the government and the wanting me to have to try and bring those people out to visit the infestations, to explain to them why having in low country like this, where all of the floodplains lead to the rest of the watercourse and the seeds floating in that watercourse heading out, is a very, very bad thing for the rest of the environment. But that's what happens when you have politicians with no morals, and then you have the heads of departments like biosecurity, where the actual top heads of that department sit on other committees. They sit up and chair on other committees that advise other committees that advise other committees that then advise the minister and the premier from there. So that's a very scary concept, when the people who caused this, a $250 billion problem, when they caused this, they advise the heads of the departments and the heads of the political ministers on that they could turn around and leave these materials. They could call them low risk. You know, the problem is low risk relates to them saying that they've never been successful in cleaning up Lantana, and that would be very much true with those entities. You know, the sheer numbers and scale of the issues that they've caused because of their not understanding how water moves these materials. The councils constantly say to me, you know, how come we have such massive increases in Lantana over the last 10 years? 10 years, okay? And they've acknowledged that the masses of material pouring out of all of the national parks and the national parks controlled state forests, the state forests, the main roads, TMR, how they've massively increased. Well, that's why. They've never been spread by birds. Never been spread by birds on numbers. You have a look, as far as you can see, you show me where the birds are. Birds are supposed to be moving this material. They're supposed to be the sole mover of this material before I proved that the seeds float. So that's what we face. Anyway, that's what we need to get through to the rest of the public, because these materials all float down to your land. And then it becomes your problem, and nobody helps with the costs that your family's faced with, or the destruction of your land. And as is the case with Lockyer Valley, where you see how massive the infestations are there, it is actually an insight into what the future looks like for the rest of Queensland and New South Wales. Complete consumption and complete collapse of property values. You know, we're seeing properties sold for half and a third of the price of uninfested properties. But once those lands in your local area have succumbed to that level of infestation, or like this here, then there is no out for people to sell and move out of those areas, because you'd have to have somebody who wants to buy into something like this and lose everything they ever worked for. And that is what your Premier has caused. That's what your Agricultural Minister, Mr. Mark Furner, has caused. That's what your biosecurity says they won't come out. Like, how does a government department that is responsible for the protection of the environment say we're not willing to come out? I mean, that's insanity. That is just the utter disgrace that they could ever say they're not willing to come out and discuss the levels of the infestations on the sides of roads and how that affects the ecology for hundreds of square kilometres in this particular North Coast area. Hundreds of square kilometres, and they aren't willing to discuss it. It's up to me to try and drag those departments that are responsible for these lands out. I shouldn't have to be the policeman. It's bad enough that I've got to be the conscience and also explain to people why these materials are so deadly to the environment, why they're so toxic. You eat the seeds, you will die. That's a fact. It's on record in Australia that if you eat the seeds, you will die. If your animals eat the plant, they will die. The most horrific and agonising death. Anyway, I'm Gary. I'm the Lantana Legend. Thanks for popping in, and I'll catch you on the next video. Bye-bye.